The worship theme for this month here at UUP is heritage. And I thought I would begin by admitting that in the course of my 50 years of ministry, I've come to recognize how many people come to our congregations who have been wounded by religion. Let's admit that there's no changing the past, although some people I find want to whitewash the harms done in the past. And it often has done great personal harm. True not only in collective history, but often in personal histories as well. When I was minister in New York City some years ago, I found that a great deal of my pastoral counseling, and I saw literally hundreds of people, was aimed particularly at young adults who were finally coming to terms with harms done at home or in school or in church or synagogue. And I committed to memory a poem that I often found myself reciting. It's by the English poet Philip Larkin. I've toned it down just a little because it's church after all. They mess you up, your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were messed up in their turn, like fools in old-style hats and coats, who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like the coastal shelf. Get out as quickly as you can and don't have any kids yourself. As the critic has put it, Larkin captured so accurately the inheritance of despair as to render it completely absurd. I did lots of referrals, of course, to therapists. And that reminds me of another poem by the British poet Auden, W.H. Auden, in memory of Sigmund Freud. But when he said, he wasn't clever at all. He merely told the unhappy present to recite the past, like a poetry lesson. Till Shoemaker later faltered at the line where long ago the accusations had begun, and suddenly known by whom it had been judged. How rich life had been, and how silly, and was left forgiven and more humble, able to approach the future as a friend, without a wardrobe of excuses, without a set mask of rectitude, or an embarrassing, overfamiliar gesture. Just recently, I was surprised by a phone call from a friend he made during those work years. He has now gone on to be quite a distinguished writer, a contributor to the New York Times Magazine and the author of 6 really rather insightful books of nonfiction. What he said to me was, "You once preached a sermon I've never forgotten. It was about happiness. It changed my life. And a foundation has now given me a grant to write my own spiritual autobiography. Can you find a copy of that sermon and send it to me?" I was, of course, not only flattered, but completely astonished, had he had no memory of such a sermon. But right in the left-hand drawer of my desk, I have printed old-fashioned paper files of back sermons, and son of a gun, there it was. I scanned it and sent it to him. And the mother of his children, a leading national advocate for reproductive rights, by the way, said, "That's the sermon. I remember how deeply it hit you. I remember where we were sitting together that Sunday." Now, when I reread it, then I'll spare you that sermon today. Didn't see much in it. Never thought to repeat it or publish it. What surprised me was how deeply grounded in the Bible it was. Its chief complaint being about Latter-day Christian misinterpretations of Rabbi Jesus, occasioned by a popular book in the 1980s by a California evangelist. Remember Robert Schuller of the Crystal Cathedral in Orange County with his Hour of Power on national TV? Well, he published a book with the dreadful title, The Be Happy Attitudes, based on the 8 Beatitudes that begin the Sermon on the Mount. Now, I'm perfectly aware that the word in the original language, which is Koine Greek, translated as blessed, can also be translated as happy. But happy are those who mourn. Schuller sold 1.5 million copies of that darn book by portraying Jesus as kind of a guru of positive thinking. And if you think the poor in spirit, that is, the depressed, are happy, I have a bridge I'll sell you. Maybe a better word for blessed would be something like still beloved. Around this time, I found that the standard French translation for blessed are the meek is heureux sont les débonnaires. And maybe indeed the non-anxious meek in that sense, those who are of good attitude, shall inherit the earth, or at least notice it and its generous beauty, even as the rich and the arrogant continue to mindlessly exploit it, and as climate change drives millions to uproot themselves in the pursuit just of life, if not happiness. Because there is, I must admit, a certain spiritual paradox in human existence, and I guess that's what was in the sermon. I have another friend and colleague in the UU ministry, James Ford, who is also a Zen Roshi. And I once wrote the introduction to his book, If You Are Lucky, Your Heart Will Break, which resonates with my own sense of spirituality, both back then and today. If you are lucky, your heart will open up. We start in life trying to meet the inherited expectations of parents and religion, and these days, particularly of secular society. But if we're lucky, our heart breaks, and we're opened to what Buddhists call reality, and which Western religion sometimes terms grace. That is the awareness of what I've come to call the unmerited beauty of being alive, which simply calls us to greet every new day as what it is, a gift, in which we're given a new chance to start over and over. Not happy days always, God knows, but days in which there is an underlying available joy in the simple realization that we are still breathing and having a fresh chance today to live more fully and wisely and well. 2 months from now, in mid-November, I will be going back to Knoxville, Tennessee, where I was ordained to this ministry 50 years ago. Not just to the UU ministry, I insisted that my ordination was to the ministry of the Church Universal, as defined by a Hindu sage whose words are to be found in the back of our hymnal. The church that abjures all that separates and divides. which seeks truth and freedom, justice and love, and individual discipline in social duty. Quote. For that occasion, I'll preach some memories of ministry at the place where I was ordained. How lucky I was to be at the only racially integrated congregation in that city. A group that knew that its purpose was creating justice beyond its walls and celebrating greater diversity in its midst. When I'm asked about my early ministry, I sometimes say, well, in Knoxville, it was like running a theological decompression chamber for people with the Baptist bends. Some of those abused and repressed people had to be put under some gentle pressure from what had bothered them in the first place, bad Bible, with at least some of its good parts, like the question, what have you done lately to serve justice, practice compassion and mercy, and walk a little bit more humbly on this earth? But no heritage of faith or family or otherwise, no matter how much harm it may have done, and I will never do anything but honor the real wounds that people have suffered. No heritage is beyond the help of reciting the past like a poetry lesson until you come to the place where the accusations began, and then realize that there are other interpretations, liberations, and outcomes that are possible, even if still a little hidden. Which brings me to my main message for today, I guess. Every heritage, family, or faith, or secular approach to life is a mixed bag at best. We are to prove all things, that is, test them, and then hold fast to that which is good. That's the scriptural text that the spiritual founder of Unitarianism in America, William Ellery Channing, used when he preached the sermon that really launched our approach to liberating faith. The most reprinted sermon, by the way, of the early 19th century. This morning, I began at 9 o'clock with a small gathering of people for adult religious education about the history of our tradition, including, I was very careful to include some of the gross mistakes we've made and had to learn from, since both Universalists and Unitarians emerged on this continent at the time of the American Revolution. And I'm going to continue such dialogues about our social justice work, our intellectual and theological development, and our present mission and prospects, both here in Petaluma and nationally and globally, on the next 3 occasions when I'm out here to preach, on the 15th of October, the 5th of November, and the 3rd of December. And tomorrow night, as Bonnie pointed out, and is on the back of the order of service, I also invite you in this no obligation introductory session on Zoom. Why bother with the Bible? Well, I can think of several reasons. Some is so that if you do feel you've been harmed, the healing can begin. God knows it's been used to reinscribe patriarchy and homophobia and obtuseness about our environmental obligations and to justify slavery and exploitation of Mother Earth, but it doesn't stop at one interpretation. The very definition of a classic in literature, you know, is a book that bears more than one reading, that bears going back to and re-understanding. There's always more, another side of the story. about human dependence on nature as lifted up in Sukkot, for example, or the love between David and Jonathan, or the interpretation of Sodom as more a story about the violation of hospitality than any condemnation of same-sex love. And of course, at its core, the Hebrew tradition remains one of liberation from bondage in Egypt into the responsibilities of freedom and covenantal community, which should still be something we can identify with. Next week in San Francisco, I'm going to be preaching about how the Bible was used to justify the near genocide of Native Americans on this continent. And it was on the basis of a mythical interpretation of a conquest of Canaan that never occurred. Too many of us, I think, in my pastoral experience, haven't really dealt sufficiently with the religious heritage that shaped our culture. Haven't dealt with it at least since adolescence. But you know, it is a mistake always to leave anything at the level you understood it at when you were 15 or 16. What we rejected about what we heard in confirmation classes, in college discussions, or whatever, it's terrible to stay reactive. Among other things, because that stand in life can be both disempowering and a bit immature. My colleague in New York, the late Forrest Church, during the years we worked together, penned a book called God and Other Famous Liberals. As the son of Idaho U.S. Senator Frank Church, whose life has recently been celebrated in a biography called nothing less than The Last Honest Man, for courageously taking on how corporate America had captured the CIA and the FBI as agencies for Cold War imperialism. Forrest knew quite realistically how important it is to counter traditional interpretations of shared heritage with more progressive views. Does the American flag stand for nothing but nostalgia and MAGA nationalism? No. For me, I hope for you, it represents the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. And does motherhood, is that the possession of those who would misogynistically repress the rights of women for reproductive choice? No. We honor motherhood as something that every woman should choose when she is ready for it, if she is ready for it. Do liberals value apple pie? Yeah. And are we willing to allow literalists and oppressive voices all the interpretation of our spiritual heritage about God or the Spirit? No. We are aiming to heal ourselves and the world, to admit our own traumas and take up responsibility for offering an alternative interpretation, one that aims for greater wholeness in a nation now polarized by the clear political manipulation of heritage. By turning over the central symbols of our culture to the right wing, said Forrest, we liberals made a critical mistake. We contributed to the harm. Now, in the season that our Jewish sisters and brothers call the season of returning, teshuvah, we ourselves need to return to the sources and find there something still living, refreshing, deeper than we knew. To reclaim, as Emerson put it, an original relation to the universe, the ever-evolving universe. Because No, the world is not beyond redemption, and none of us are entirely without our mistakes, our sins, our obtuseness. All too often, let's admit it, focus just on immediate happiness and heedless that none of us can be fully happy until all have entered into the beloved community that we long for and are meant for. Along the way, may we never lose sight of that amazing grace that a wiser interpretation of our heritage can reveal to us in all of our mistakes, and that can then sustain us on the way to a healthier and more wholesome future. So may it be.